And joining us now on the debate for the full hour tonight, in Vancouver, British Columbia, Catherine Harrison, Professor of Political Science at UBC. In the nation's capital, John Ibbitson, Ottawa Bureau Chief at the Globe and Mail. And with us here in our studios, Rick Smith, Executive Director of Environmental Defence Canada, and Benjamin Dacus, Senior Policy Analyst at the C.D. Howe Institute. Good to have you guys here in the studio, and to our guests and Points Beyond, we thank you for joining us tonight. I just want to start by reading a few points that were in the March 29th federal budget that related to the environment. There were not a lot, there were a few, but we'll read them here. For example, the budget called for a streamlining of the environmental assessment process and restricting it to a maximum of 24 months. It eliminated a federal advisory panel called the National Roundtable on the Environment and the Economy, and it added $8 million over 2 years to the Canada Revenue Agency to ensure that charities devote their resources to charitable work and to improve transparency by asking them to disclose the extent to which their political activities are funded by foreign sources. More money for the institution we used to call Revenue Canada to keep an eye, for example, on you, Rick. All right, let's get into this, shall we? John Ibbitson, to you first. Let's just go through some initial first impressions of those budgetary proposals. What's your thought?
Well, I think there are two things that work here. The one is the perfectly reasonable assumption that reviews ought to take place in a timeline that is sufficient for a reasonable outcome, such that we know what is going to happen one way or another. In other words, just as refugee tribunals should not drag on so long that it becomes impossible to ever eject a refugee from Canada, so too environmental tribunals should not go on for so long that it becomes impossible to get any kind of decision as to whether a particular project should go ahead or not go ahead. That's the reasonable side of it. On the other side of it, there is the question, the allegation, that the Conservatives are targeting environmental groups in order to eliminate them as an obstacle to resource development, that they may also be targeting First Nations groups who are trying to block resource development as well, and that really they want to steamroller ahead with whatever it is that they wish to propose, especially as it pertains to oil and gas in Alberta, so that they can diversify their markets and bring all sorts of revenues. The question is, to what extent is this simply a reasonable approach to take in order to streamline those processes, and to what extent is this a witch hunt to shut down environmental groups? Okay,
that's the reasonable versus the unreasonable, according to John Ibbitson. Catherine Harrison, why don't you come in and give us your first impressions of those environmental planks in the Conservative budget?
Sure. I think that President Obama's rejection, even if it may only be temporary, of the Keystone XL pipeline was a real wake-up call for the Canadian oil and gas industry and for the Harper government, which has really thrown its support towards diversifying Canada's resource sector by finding new markets in Asia, by getting that oil and gas out through British Columbia to China and other Asian countries. And one of the big obstacles to that endeavor has been environmentalist opposition to those projects and the environmental assessment process that the federal government has put in place itself to ensure that project development in Canada is done in an environmentally safe manner. And the kinds of changes that are proposed to the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act in Budget 2012 are not just about reducing red tape, streamlining the process, getting rid of bureaucracy, which is how it's framed, but I think allowing the federal government to reduce its role in environmental assessments, to delegate many decisions and even delegate the whole assessment to provincial governments. And that's been a long-standing irritant between the federal government and the provinces. I think duplication and overlap sound bad to everyone, but sometimes duplication and overlap serve very important policy purposes. So that's one strand. The other strand is clearly trying to marginalize and discredit environmental opposition to those projects.
And we happen to have one of those people right here at the table right now. Rick, you want to chime in here and tell us what you thought of those proposals from the federal budget?
Sure. I don't feel marginalized, but you know, I do agree that what we've seen in the budget is really a very significant shift in industrial policy. I mean, taken together, I mean, these I think really inappropriate artificial timelines and environmental assessment, very significantly the suggestion that these will be made retroactive even to existing hearings, which have thrown First Nations in northern British Columbia, for instance. I'm not aware that it has. I mean, not surprisingly, it's thrown First Nations in northern British Columbia into a tailspin because they had only been recently enticed to participate in this process. All of a sudden, that's being short-circuited. And then, as Catherine's saying, these changes to, or suggested changes to a charitable law, very transparently aimed at trying to smear environmental charities like mine.
So you felt targeted on that one?
Oh, there's no question. If you look at since January, the federal government, the oil industry, and its surrogates have just been on a rampage talking about how environmental groups need to be stopped. That somehow our participation in this democratic debate is inappropriate.
Shall we find out whether your participation is inappropriate or not? Because we happen to have somebody from the industry here. Can we welcome to our metaphorical table here in Calgary, Alberta, Brenda Kenny, who is the president and CEO of CEPA, the Canadian Energy Pipeline Association. And Brenda, let me just give you, first of all, welcome to the program, and let me give you a chance, I should say welcome back, because you've been on before. And let me give you a chance to speak to those proposals that were in the federal budget as they're related to the environment. What were your overarching thoughts?
Well, I think it's important to remember that we've been at the increasingly improved environmental assessment for many decades now, and there's no reason to think that legislation that was originally introduced before EA was common is still satisfactory for Canada's needs. I think it is appropriate to modernize, and we have a very thorough EA process across the country now in various provinces. So building forward on that, I think there's a recognition that for large-scale projects, an appropriate length of time is a good thing. When we look at actual results, there are many, many projects that come in much less time than that, and it's an opportunity to be clear about expectations so that everybody involved in the process can focus on the things that matter most and not spend as much time on just process, but put our efforts towards solutions that actually matter for the environment.
Okay, a lot of things worth following up on there, but I'm going to hold off for a second because, Ben, you need your first kick at this as well. What do you say?
Well, what the government did with the budget is change the pipeline review process. But there are more fundamental questions about what the NEB or any other regulator looks at. What issues have standing in the environmental process? What you're seeing is that the pipeline review process becomes this catch-all forum for debate for issues, everything from oil sands to Aboriginal issues. But the question that needs to be addressed now is what issues can the regulator itself deal with? It has mandates and has a jurisdiction over pipeline issues, oil spills, things like that. But what are things that it doesn't really have any power over? Things like emissions that come from the oil sands. What the government needs to look at now is what comes next, is what actually is in the hands of the NEB, or what's the government's power, what the government, federal and provincial, what the governments need to do themselves.
Okay, let me follow up with John on a couple of these things. John, I think most people think you're a pretty fair-minded observer. I hope so anyway, that your readers feel that, of what goes on up there on Parliament Hill. So I'll just ask you directly, do you think these provisions were put in the budget to target groups like RICS because the Conservatives want them out of the way?
Yes. I think that on the one hand, as I said, some of this is nothing more than the clearing away of extraneous regulations, the putting in place a credible process for coming to reasonable decisions about natural resource development. But there are other things in this process that strike me as deeply suspicious. For example, the idea of harmonizing with the provinces. We know there are cases where provincial environmental assessments cleared away projects. I'm thinking, for example, of the Fish Lake proposal for a big mine in the interior of British Columbia of a couple of years ago, where the British Columbia environmental assessment said, well, it's going to have a devastating environmental impact, but who cares? We need the mine. And it took a federal environmental assessment to finally block that mine. So are they downloading to the provinces or coordinating with the provinces in order to go to the lowest common denominator? Are they, any one of us does not like to have the Canada Revenue Agency coming and taking a look at our taxes. Are they, in fact, providing these resources in order to frighten environmental groups into withdrawing or at least toning down the level of their obstruction or objections to pipeline proposals? I just don't think that that a reasonable person looking at these proposals can believe that anything other than part of it, at least, is an attempt by the government not just to streamline, but to make it easier for natural resource projects to go ahead and to cow or to sideline the opposition to those projects.
And Brenda, let me follow up with you. You know, the word streamlining was used in the budget, but you won't be surprised to hear that some environmental groups think the word streamlining is really a euphemism for rubber stamping. Do you really want your projects rubber stamped?
No, we don't want our projects rubber stamped, and I think the problem here is we're getting a couple of different issues mixed up. First of all, what matters most in EA, and can that be done in a focused way so that all of us, stakeholders, governments, and industry, are focusing on things that matter most, as opposed to tripping over tens of thousands or 20,000 different information requests, many of which that are not relevant to the issue at hand. So we do need some better management of good processes and direct energy toward things that are going to make a difference for the environment. A well-planned project has got 3 or 4 years of active consultation and studies before it even gets into the public review. And those sort of projects are the ones that our proponents will bring forward, having discussed a lot of these issues with stakeholders well in advance. Now, a pipeline company is not going to tackle the question of whether or not in 10 years none of us drive a car. That's a broader policy question, but there's no reason to think that it's appropriate or helpful to Canada to have those sort of issues brought into a pipeline hearing matter. So I think in fairness, we need to collaborate towards solutions and focus on things that actually matter in hand and put better processes in place around appropriate policy development. That's fine too.
Okay,
but
let me just get
demonizing anybody.
I hear you. I want to get Rick Smith in here to respond to that, but before he does, one area of clarification. Do you think some environmental groups purposely drag out these environmental assessment processes in order to essentially put you guys out of business, or at least make your life miserable?
Well, I think there may be a few. I personally don't want to demonize any groups, because I think a healthy debate is important, and it's very helpful when there are solution-oriented, pragmatic groups involved saying, hey, you should look at this. That's fantastic. But I know that there are other groups whose sole objective is to absolutely shut things down, and if you don't have a good control on the process through the regulator, the regulator will end up having to take an inordinate amount of time, and Canadians suffer as a result. It's not all about the jobs and money, but let's face it, the prosperity of the country does matter. 775,000 jobs do matter. If the right answer is no, say no. But if the right answer is eventually yes, you can't wait 5 or 6 years and assume that you get to do the project when you want to do it. You need some timely decision making to mobilize these sort of investments.
And let me put that to Rick. Would you agree that 6 years to get a yes or a no is too long?
Well, it's interesting. First of all, sometimes when the oil industry talks about this, they kind of mix apples and oranges. So one example that the federal government has recently used is the Jocelyn tar sands mine, saying that took 6 years and this is unreasonable. What they don't mention is that the ownership of the company changed over in that time, that the NEB took a look at the application, deemed it incomplete. They had to go back to the drawing board,
Okay,
come
so
back
there's
with more
extenuating
information.
circumstances
So
in that case. But
so
generally speaking, is 6 years to get to yes or no too long?
I think it depends on how big the project is. And I think when you're talking about some of the examples that John talked about, for instance, the Prosperity Mine in BC, that review took 3 years. The federal review took 3 years. Eventually that decision was no, because it was just going to be too devastating for that region. And actually that 3-year period is longer than what the federal government is currently contemplating for new environmental assessment.
Would you say your organization ever drags things out for the purpose of making companies' lives crazy?
You know what? No. What we do is we try to engage people in a debate, and I think it's important to take a look at the David and Goliath aspect of this struggle, right? Maybe you listen to industry and they're talking about environmental groups, listen to the federal government, they're talking about these radical environmental groups, never actually naming who they're talking about. Joe Oliver has been challenged on this directly, the Natural Resources Minister, to say, okay, well, who exactly are you talking about? He doesn't actually name anyone.
Radical elements.
They're talking about this sort of amorphous radical element. Our annual budget is approximately what one of these oil companies spends on toner in a year, or on pencils. So, our ability to, if anyone uses pencils anymore, so our ability to hold anything up is pretty minimal.
Okay, let me get Catherine Harrison, come on in here and give us your view on this angle.
I see the time limits on environmental assessment that are proposed as much less significant than the possibility of the federal government withdrawing from environmental assessments by delegating them to the provinces and by delegating regulatory decisions pursuant to those environmental assessments to provincial governments. And although nobody likes overlap and duplication, as taxpayers we think red tape is a bad thing, I think it's important to bring into this discussion that federal and provincial governments can have very different roles to play with these natural resource developments. And in particular, the provincial governments are typically the owners of the crown resources in questions. They create jobs, they develop their economies by either directly pursuing projects or partnership with private sector firms that develop those resources. So they often have a financial stake in pursuing these projects. And in those cases, I think it's particularly important to have the federal government play an independent role in environmental assessments and also looking out for its own areas of jurisdiction, whether it's fisheries, whether it's international trade, marine waters, and so on. And environmental assessment's been a long-standing irritant between the federal government and provincial governments. And so this proposal for the federal government to back off effectively has a 2-decade-plus history behind it.
Well, let's go after the Canada Revenue Agency angle on this. And Ben, I'll bring you in for this one. You're with the C.D. Howe Institute. You get charitable donations at the C.D. Howe Institute?
Yes, and there are a number of heads of charity, but the fundamental point of charitable status is that you're not advocating for a political party or political candidate of any level, and that you're not taking a view to of a specific position. And that here in Canada we have educational charities that are allowed to make statements on policy, but as long as they're well reasoned, and that comes to the point of a educational charity.
Okay, let's be clear. You don't back parties, right?
No, we are.
You don't back candidates?
We are a nonpartisan organization.
You take positions on issues.
Well, the C.D. Howe Institute doesn't take a direct decision on anything. These are papers published by individuals, by authors, myself, but we're a nonpartisan organization.
Are you funded by any organizations from outside of Canada?
I don't know about exactly who are, we have a lot of funding from organizations.
Okay, because presumably you would be caught in this net as well, right? You're one of these organizations that right. The Canada Revenue Agency wants to know where your money's coming from.
The question is the question inputs or outputs? The output is what the concern is. The concern is political activity, and foreign funding is a separate issue than the output of the political activity. And a charity that focuses its educational activity on well-reasoned policy arguments is conducting a charitable activity.
I don't think that's a concern here.
The concern is when it's very political, where it's something like putting out pamphlets that are allegedly under an educational reason, but really are advocating for a specific government position.
Well, I think what I've been told is that the concern is that when the output agrees with what the government's policy happens to be, then it's okay. When the output disagrees with it, that's what they want to have a deeper look at. Is that what's going on here?
Well, the question that CRA is going to have to look at is how do you define this political activity, and what things are certain types of charities doing that really are political activities versus the proper definition of an educational activity, which is something that's well reasoned and that doesn't cross the line from education to propaganda.
John, you want to help us clarify this?
Well, it is hard to clarify because, for example, I'm thinking back in the 90s when the Harris government wanted to expand the preservation of land in Northern Ontario, mostly, but it would allow some mining and some exploration and some forestry on those lands. Some of the charitable organizations and environmental groups in Ontario opposed this proposal completely, campaigned against it, fought to have it stopped. Other environmental groups actually worked actively with the government to come up with a proposal that those environmental groups could support, and did in the end. Now, who was politicking there? Were the environmental groups that were opposing this proposal, come hell or high water, were they engaging in political activity when they opposed it? Were those groups that were actually negotiating with the government for a set of criteria that those groups themselves could then endorse? Were they engaging in political activity? And how would a revenue agency decide which was political activity and which was not? I find this all very muddy waters.
Rick?
Well, I would just say there's a lot of concern in the charitable community, in the philanthropic community, about this this kind of broad smear that there's somehow something improper about Canadian charities accepting donations from outside the country. I mean, the very nature of charities in our globalized marketplace.
Well, he says it's not that. He says it's the output. It's not the input. It's the output.
Well, I wish he would tell the Harper government that, because the budget is very clear in this. Perpetuates this smear that there's somehow something improper in accepting foreign donations. I mean, charities are international these days. I mean, charities take on AIDS in Africa, take on poverty issues internationally. Canadians by the millions donate to charities every day.
But I asked him this, so let me ask you: does your organization endorse candidates?
Absolutely not.
Do you endorse political parties?
No.
Do you endorse particular positions on issues? Yes, you do that.
Yeah, absolutely we do. And
So
but we are, I mean, as Ben says, I mean, charities are capped in terms of the amount of advocacy that you do. It's very, very clearly defined. And so, this idea that the government is perpetuating, that somehow charities are acting improperly in engaging in these infrastructure debates and these energy debates is just nonsense.
Brenda, are you completely comfortable with this kind of change? Let me just put it like that.
I think the devil's in the details, as this discussion would convey, and I think what's important to me is that we can function in Canada in a way that we have civil discourse that's productive, that's oriented towards solutions that matter to Canadians, and we don't allow ourselves to be dragged into rabbit holes that stymie a productive, positive Canadian dialogue. That's what I do occasionally see happening, certainly not by all groups. And I think it's important to hit the reset button and remind ourselves what Canadian values are really about.
Catherine, let me get you on this. I don't think I've heard anybody yet say this is analogous to Richard Nixon sicking the IRS on his political enemies. But I have heard some people say parts of this make them uncomfortable, that there are kinds of tests being put on various environmental organizations here that seem to be in the crosshairs of this government because of their opposition to this government's policies. Is that fair to say?
Yes, I think it is. There's no mention in those sections of the budget of environmental groups, but based on Mr. Harper and Mr. Oliver's statements, it seems like that is what's motivating this. And there's two parts to it. There's the question of what percent of these charitable groups' activities are being devoted to advocacy work. And then there's a part about increasing transparency of foreign funding to these groups. And with respect to the latter, it's ironic, I think, to say the least, and even hypocritical, that we're so concerned about foreign funders of charitable groups, but we don't seem to have the same level of concern about foreign investors in Canadian national resource industries or foreign customers for our exports. So as long as the foreign money is helping us make money, we're not concerned. But if the foreigners are investing in environmental causes, it seems to be a much greater concern. And I do find that very troubling. I'm not a big fan of the idea of foreign money interfering with Canadian politics in any respects. But if we're going to talk about foreign money, let's talk about the many different forms of influence that foreign money is having in Canada.
Ben, does that seem inconsistent to you?
Just a quick point that the real fundamental issue is the outputs. And what the budget did is it actually made it easier for charities to give to foreign charities elsewhere. So while it restricted,
Sorry, say that again?
So there was the question of foreign charities that are say in Haiti for earthquake relief. The budget actually made it easier for Canadian charities to help those sorts of charities out. So it's a matter of the outputs, not the inputs.
Okay, but that's not controversial. What we're talking about here is the controversy.
But the point is that the focus should be on the outputs. It's not about the foreign funding that you see on the inputs. Whether the question is should Canadian charities not be able to accept foreign donations?
Unless I'm completely misunderstanding this issue, the controversy is about whether or not the government is trying to silence its political critics by using the Canada Revenue Agency. Honourable people can disagree about whether they are or they aren't, but that's what the issue is, I think. Is it not?
I'd agree. But the question is, how do you define a political activity? And Canadian charities, Canadian environmental charities, are still going to have a scope to provide well-reasoned educational information. They can't engage in political activity.
Let me ask Rick right beside you. Are you going to have to change the way you do things in order to comply with this new procedure?
Well, I mean, obviously we'll comply we'll comply with whatever is required of us. But and the devil is in the details, as Brenda says. But let's trace this back to where this rhetoric started about charities. It started in January of this year, with the federal government going on about radical environmentalists, quote unquote, interfering in infrastructure debates. It started with the federal government. There was a very interesting memo that the media covered, a foreign affairs memo that labeled environmental groups in Canada and First Nations, labeled them adversaries of the state. So there's within the space of just a few months, the government has really polarized this issue.
Let me get Brenda.
And demonized some of us.
Go ahead, Brenda.
I was just going to say, I think in fairness, Rick, certainly the temperature on this has risen in the last few months. But as any of us watching this issue know, there have been quite a lot of active journalistic forensics on this over the last year and a half. And those have pointed to some significant campaigns that, far outweigh anything we've seen in Canada before, directed toward some specific objectives. I think what the government is doing is trying to lend a measure of transparency. If we find that we're comfortable with the status quo in terms of how Canada functions, that's great. If there are some surprises along the way about how people are intervening with particular political interests that are counter to what the voting public chooses, that might be something to look at. I'm not in favor of, as I said before, of demonizing any groups, but I am in favor on all counts, including with industry, on transparency. I think it's important for Canadians to have the straight goods and to have faith in our systems.
Okay, let me put a larger, more overarching issue on the table and get us into some discussion on that. And to do that, I want to quote one of the post-budget pieces that Paul Wells and Tamsin McMahon wrote for Maclean's magazine. It goes like this. Last year, stuff we dug out of the ground, chopped down, or farmed made up 26% of everything we sold to the world, up from just 9% in 1998. Over that same period, stuff we actually made and manufactured fell to around 1/3 of exports, down from more than half. Exports of natural resources, worth $119 billion last year, now account for a greater share of our outgoing trade than at any time in the last 40 years. While Canada enjoys a trade surplus of $73 billion in natural resources, the country is running a $100 billion trade deficit in manufacturing, a shortfall that spells serious trouble for central Canada. John, get us into some discussion about this. This sounds like we are being described as the traditional hewer of wood, drawer of water, which we've been told for the last half century is the business we've got to sort of get out of and make our living with our brains as opposed to our brawn. What do you think?
Yes, but it's a good thing too. You're right. We were traditionally a resource-based economy. We take great pride in the fact that from the Second World War on, Canada developed a more and more sophisticated manufacturing economy, and it was that with which we made our way in the world. But the fact remains that all manufacturing economies in Europe, in the United States, and Canada are challenged by third world countries who are making things cheaper than we make them because they have lower wage rates and other inputs. So everyone is finding it harder and harder to sell things. The good news for Canada is that those same economies that are manufacturing more cheaply than we are need our natural resources. It is, in the end, great news for Canada that even as Ontario struggles to make cars and other things, there are other things that we can sell overseas, minerals and wood and especially oil, to buoy up the economy so that we can continue to have healthcare, we can continue to have education, we can continue to have equalization payments. It's perhaps in a perfect world, we would be selling cars and selling oil in equal measure overseas. But better that we have this fallback position than many other countries which don't.
In which case, Catherine, follow up and tell us whether you think it's possible to have the resource-based, robust resource-based economy that we now have alongside a healthy environmental movement at the same time.
That's a tough question. I think we need to. If we're going to have a healthy economy, we're going to need to have a healthy environment within Canada and also for the planet. And I think one of the things we don't talk a lot about when we talk about proposed pipelines, the Enbridge Northern Gateway pipeline, the possible doubling of Kinder Morgan, expansion of natural gas exports from British Columbia from, by a factor of 3, expansion of coal exports, is what happens if we do a great job of getting those things out of the ground, we get them to tankers, nothing sinks, everything goes right, and they get to the consumers, and then they're used as intended. Those fossil fuels get burned and contribute massive quantities of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. That'll have the same impact on Canada's environment as if those emissions took place in our own backyards. So to some degree, we're promoting economic development within Canada by exporting environmental problems to other countries.
So Brenda, the question for you then is, if we're to have a robust resources-based economy, does that necessarily require that we have a kind of a downgraded environmental movement?
Not at all. And a couple of key points on this. First of all, we have one of the most transparent regulatory regimes in the world, and we're getting better over time, and the results of that are very clear. If we think that by not shipping oil or natural gas to China is going to change their driving habits and really affect that curve on the consumption of fossil fuels, that's not plausible. We around the world, we have a fossil fuel consumption now in around 90 million barrels a day. That has to change gradually over time as we introduce new technologies. But our opportunity in Canada is to say, look, it happens that crude oil is expensive on the world market today, just like gold is. When we've got natural resources that with a sophisticated approach we can develop and sell, that gives us revenue that we can reinvest in wind or solar, nuclear, whatever type of non-emitting form you choose. There's lots of options we have with capital that we don't have without it. And again, our choice to export or not has no bearing whatsoever on the GHG consumption curve around the world.
Rick, can we have a strong, robust, resources-based economy and yet still have you guys firing on all cylinders, if you'll pardon the pun, at the same time?
Well, absolutely. And in fact, the oil industry is increasingly anomalous in not recognizing this. I mean, the oil industry is spending very little money actually abating its pollution, actually, honestly.
That is absolutely
okay, hang on, Brenda. Brenda, hang on. We'll let you come back at that in a second. Go ahead.
Engaging with its critics. But let's take a look at the forest industry. If we go back 20 years, there were huge conflicts in British Columbia, all across this country, between forest companies and the environmental movement. And over the course of the last couple of decades, things have changed. In fact, now you have the recent Canadian Boreal Forest Agreement signed between pretty much every forest company that matters, every large environmental group in the country, a partnership to move forward in a new way to rebrand Canadian forest products internationally as green products. That happened because both sides sincerely engaged. So I think it's very interesting.
But the example you've said is you can have kind of green wood. Can you have green oil?
Well, I think you can have a much more productive dialogue between the oil industry and its critics than you have at the moment. There are some obvious differences. The oil industry is much larger than the forest industry, is much more aggressive in many ways. But sure, I mean, we can come up with a new kind of dialogue if the oil industry agrees to abate its pollution and agrees that it's a transitional fuel, that we need to move towards renewables, we need to move towards non-polluting energy sources.
Brenda, over to you.
Well, first of all, I'll just speak for pipelines, and some of our big companies are among the very largest investors in renewables today, and that's because they have some cash flow and they're moving that capital into renewables in a very large way. In fact, for example, TransCanada Pipelines will, once they refurbish the Bruce Power, will be providing over 25% of non-emitting power in the province of Ontario. I think those are very positive moves, and I do agree with Rick. A positive conversation is important, and I applaud the Boreal Forest Agreement, but one has to recall that that agreement did not include a variety of other stakeholders who are also land users in those regions. And secondly, they weren't faced with the social challenge of saying to everybody who uses lumber to build their home, we don't want you to use lumber at all anymore. And I'm the first in line to say we need to move forward on reducing emissions overall, but we also at the same time have to recognize we have a social duty to not create shockwaves in our current lifestyles and economies. We need to find a pathway toward transition that people accept. We look at the power prices in Ontario. People are angry with good reason, but we need to be more honest and transparent about what that transition looks like.
Okay, in which case, let me take yet another step back and again get John Ibbitson in here to give us the sort of, what do they say, the view at 35,000 feet of what this is all about, and then we can pick apart that a little more. John, I'm trying to remember if you were on December 2nd, 2006 at that leadership convention at which the Liberal Party of Canada picked Stéphane Dion as their chief, running on a green shift. That looked like, certainly in our lifetimes, as good a moment for the environment politically as we've seen in decades. And we all know what happened, and we all know where the environment is today on people's radar screens. And my, I guess, simple two-word question is, what happened?
What happened is what always happens, and Rick's probably going to object to this, but nonetheless it is a political reality that simply can't be denied. The environment floats to the top as an important issue in the consciousness of voters when everything else is going wonderfully well. In fact, pollsters use it almost as a barometer of how well things are going. When you've got a job, when your taxes are low, when the budget is balanced, when the kids are in school, when everything else is going tickety-boo, then people start to worry about the environment. Whenever anything else starts to go south, the environment plummets as an issue. And that is why politicians who run on environmental issues almost never get elected. And it's why whenever times become difficult, as they have been for the last few years, the environment plummets to the bottom of people's consciousness. I'm sorry, I wish it weren't the case. I wish people were more altruistic than that. But right now, you can't get anywhere running on an environmental platform. And I think it's going to be some time before you can.
Rick, you know, 3.5 years ago, the green shift was the official party position of the Liberal Party of Canada, and they were proudly marching off to the polls, at the beginning anyway, on that.
Yeah.
Today, they won't even speak of it anymore. And this issue has gone away. So tell us, what's happened?
Uncharacteristically, I would say that John is completely wrong on this point. It doesn't happen very often, but
what part of that didn't you like?
Let's just be clear about what we're talking about here. When we talk about the environment, the environmental debate, we're talking about this big, ungainly, gawky thing that's everything from, you know, the relative merits of organic carrots to the ins and outs of energy policy, right? On many, in terms of a lot of metrics that you could look at, something fundamental has changed in terms of people's attitude towards the environment, and I think it's something to do with an acknowledgement that protecting the environment is important for their quality of life. And so,
except he did just say that and then said it always starts there but never ends up there.
But even after the recession, we see rates of organic food and local food consumption way up. We see rates of green consumerism, people buying less toxic things, way up. I mean, surely a cultural bellwether is the fact that Martha Stewart's new line of green cleaning products is green and non-toxic. Surely that's a cultural moment of sorts.
And all volunteer purchases. There's nothing there about a green shift in taxation. There's nothing there about we're going to charge higher, you know, we're going to put the GST up a point to help clean up the Great Lakes. None of that.
Well, so my point is that in terms of many aspects of environmental policy, toxic chemicals, smog reduction, national park creation, there's been major progress in the last few years, and progress continues right now. Where progress is stalled, and where we do need to figure it out, is global warming policy, energy policy at the federal level. And even there, we see major progress provincially, municipally, right across the country. So to the extent to which, you know, the stall at the federal level trickles down to the provincial level and municipal level, I think remains to be seen.
Catherine, you want to help us break the tie here? You more with Rick or you more with John on this one?
I'm more with John, unfortunately. There's two kinds of questions pollsters ask Canadians about the environment. The first is, do you care about the environment? And everybody says yes, and they do care. They're worried about health impacts on themselves and their children. They're worried about wilderness preservation and so on, as Rick was saying. The other type of question, though, is what is the most important problem facing the country today? An open-ended question that tries to elicit what's the top issue on people's mind. And the environment, as John said, during a prolonged period of economic growth, the environment tends to come out of nowhere, and in late 2006 until early 2008, the environment was the single most frequently cited issue as the most important problem. But as soon as the economy started to soften, and certainly when we entered an economic recession late that same year, the environment sunk from the top of the polls. So people care, but it's not clear that they're really paying a lot of attention, and especially those marginal voters, the ones who are arguably the difference between a minority government and a majority government, the 50-somethings who live in the suburbs, who commute in single occupancy vehicles to work, are not spending a lot of their time thinking about the environment right now, even if it's something that, if you ask them, do you care about it, they'd say yes. And that creates a very great political challenge, I think.
Ben, let me get you to weigh in on this angle, and lest we be too categorical about any of this. The fact is, last October, the guy who's now the Premier of Ontario went back to the polls and won an election that very few people who are supposed to know about these things thought he was going to win, by doubling down on renewable energy and campaigning on stuff that everybody said was a turkey politically. But he won. Didn't get his majority, but he won. So is this to say that this whole idea of the environment as good policy and even as popular policy may not be as completely discredited as some people think?
I think part of the reason why it was more politically popular than other environmental aspects or other environmental pushes from other levels of government or parties was that the government linked it to jobs. It was about green jobs. But if you look at the evidence, if you look at how much governments, the provincial government, through consumers, our consumers are paying for this green energy, per job, it's a very expensive subsidy program. So it may make good politics, but is it very good policy? It's going to lead to very high electricity costs for Ontario consumers.
John, what about that? McGuinty doubled down on what everybody thought was pretty unpopular green environmentalism, and he ended up stealing a lot of votes from the Green Party itself, and he got a major minority government out of it.
But I'm not sure, and I tend to be corrected if somebody has seen exit polling data that I haven't seen, that he didn't lose as many votes as he gained. That yes, energy prices have gone through the roof in this province, and that whatever green jobs were supposed to be created are hard to locate. In fact, all I see in the headlines is that McGuinty has canceled this wind power project. McGuinty is removing subsidies for this solar power project. I think, in fact, McGuinty may well have lost as many votes from people who don't understand what his energy policy is or what it produced, but do understand that their electricity bills went through the roof, as he might have gained from those who were agreeing with him on this so-called doubling down. It's very hard to parse which votes went NDP and which votes went Tory and which votes went Liberal when you look at it only as an environmental or energy issue. I do think there were other and more important factors at play that led to the result that we got.
Rick, is that a good point? He might have lost as many votes as he gained through his green policies?
No, I think if you talk to the Ontario Liberals, they think that it was a net vote getter for them. But I just want to come back to this idea that somehow energy prices are coming up disproportionately in Ontario versus elsewhere. Energy prices are going up all across this country, and the reason is that we've let transmission lines and energy infrastructure get to a really bad state, and we have to reinvest across the board. I mean, the reality is that that wind power now costs the same amount in Ontario as natural gas plants. Wind and solar, in many cases, are actually cheaper than nuclear power is.
Wait a sec. Can we do the numbers on this?
Yeah.
Nukes are what, 5 cents a kilowatt hour to produce power?
No, if you do the true cost accounting on nukes, if you add in the fact that, for instance, the companies have no real liability, the taxpayer assumes all liability in the case of accidents, and if you look at the cost curve, most importantly.
What are you going to put the number at? You're going to say it's 40?
The California Electricity Commission actually just looked at this, and they peg it as somewhere between 17 and 35 cents a kilowatt hour, which is
not far from wind or solar.
In fact, higher than wind right now in Ontario. So the cost curves are important as well. Fossil fuels are going up. Nuclear, it costs twice today what it did 10 years ago to build a nuclear power plant. In terms of new technology.
Okay.
Costs for wind and solar are coming down.
Forgive me. Brenda, I know you want to weigh in on the McGuinty government's green energy policies. However, we got less than 10 minutes to go here, and I want to move on to one last thing and get it on the table. But before I do that, actually, I do want to say a week Thursday, we're going to do a program on all of this. Just one program on the specifics of the green energy policies of the government of Ontario. Are they working? Do they cost too much? And if you want to be on that show, you better talk to the producer quickly. Anyway, that's Mark Rosen's doing that. Here's what I want to read to finish off our program today. And this was by Thomas Homer Dixon, who wrote in John Ibbitson's paper back on the 7th of April, that in a world in economic turmoil, Ontario's most important asset, its network of excellent public universities and public colleges, is often overlooked. If effectively employed, it could help Ontario pivot to confront the global economy's long-term trends. The most important of these trends is a multi-decade shift from fossil fuels to carbon-free energy. The shift will accelerate as oil becomes harder to produce and climate change worsens. Once climate change really starts affecting people's lives, when it cuts world grain production, for instance, people will demand action. The action will come in the form of regulations and taxes that raise the price of carbon fuels. Nothing provocative for Brenda to comment on there, but okay, start us off, Brenda, and we'll go around on that.
Sure. Well, that's just fine, and I think that the time frame that he's talking about there, as he said, is multi-decades, and that's exactly where we would be as well. It's important to confront these issues and to do it in a way that really benefits true sustainable development, social, economic, and environmental, jointly and in an integrated way. So I think that the past conversation's a very sound one about Ontario needs a stable energy mix. There's a variety of prices. There's a variety of reliability. Some days it's windy, some days it's not. Some days hydro's running well, some years it's dry. You've got to look ahead to be stable. And so the main thing I would say on this is the conversation about the raw politics and the flip-flops are what we need to collectively recognize requires stable long-term policy that gets us to a positive place. And as far as offshore exports of oil and gas, that, in my books, is a very positive contributor because it's one of our largest avenues for cash flow into government coffers that gives us choices for education and reinvestment, like the reinvestment Rick was mentioning.
Catherine, I want you to weigh in on this angle of it. We just had, I don't have to tell you, one of the warmest winters any of us can remember. And far from running into people on a daily basis who said to me, boy, this is terrible. This is really unnatural. We are going to pay a price for this. People said, isn't this fantastic? I wonder whether people are not that perturbed about the environment and climate change after all. That's a terrible thing to be faced with, but is it possible that that's where the Canadian public is at?
I would give the public a little more credit than that. I think as Canadians, we all love to gripe about the weather. We don't like cold winters. We're the first to go for the climate change joke. But I think that the average person actually understands that it's more complicated than that we're already seeing profound impacts around the world from climate change. I want to come back to this question of a multi-decade plan for public policy, because what we seldom talk about is we're already 2 decades into talking about Canada's response to climate change, and we've done almost nothing. So, we started talking about this in about 1990. It's 2012. We don't have a national price on carbon. We don't have in place the kind of policies nationally that would promote that kind of transition from fossil fuel-based economic development to the kinds of green jobs that Homer Dixon's editorial was talking about. And I'd feel a lot better about what we're doing now if there were any sort of policy, a policy framework in place that gave me confidence. But what Canadian governments of Liberal and Conservative governments alike have done is held press conferences, announced targets, but they haven't put in place the kinds of policies that are needed to get us to where we need to go. And we still don't have them, and that's a huge problem for us.
Rick, is it true that we just don't care as much about the environment or climate change as people in your line of work think we should?
No, I don't. In fact, a lot of people I've talked to about the weather, yes, people enjoy walking around in shorts, but there's they're pretty freaked out about it, and they realize that it's going to come back to bite us at some point. I mean, the important point here is that, getting back to Brenda's comment, the disagreement between the environmental movement and the oil industry is not about whether oil should be replaced by renewables and non-carbon fuel sources.
What's it about?
It's about when that's going to happen. So Brenda talks about, at some point down the road, 50 years, maybe,
and you want it
sort
now.
of. I mean, if we take climate change seriously, and if you take a look at the recent science around climate change and reflect on the impacts, we got to do it quickly. And we need to, the good news is that a lot of provinces are taking this seriously and they're moving quickly.
Ben, time to put a price on carbon?
Well, yeah, that's probably going to be the most effective way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions at a relatively low cost. What the government has looked at doing for coal-fired power plants is imposing that any new power plants, coal power plants, introduce carbon capture and storage. But a longer-term approach that's going to have a lower cost to consumers isn't going to be through picking wind power as being the ultimate solution, or carbon capture as the ultimate solution, but putting a price on carbon, a transparent price, that's going to let companies figure out what the cheapest way to reduce emissions is.
John, it is true that the leader of the Green Party of Canada did win her seat in the last election, the first time any Green candidate ever won at the polls in Canadian history. But as you look around and survey what's happening on the environmental scene in Canada right now, do you see any similar victories out there?
No, I don't. There are two things here. And I'm sorry to put such a damp squib on this, but I do not detect any genuine broad consensus on the part of the electors, especially those middle-class suburban electors who choose governments, especially those surrounding the GTA and Vancouver, the Lower Mainland. It's just not that high a priority for them. I also don't have much confidence in the ability of governments anywhere at the provincial or federal level to plan in the long term. Democracy just doesn't work that way. We work about the issue that's before us now, the priority that matters now. 6 months, a year, maybe even 3 years is a terribly ambitious thing to ask a democratic government to plan for. They're just not built to act that way. Here's the only good thing about this, if you want to say that, the only consolation. I have a tremendous respect for Thomas Homer Dixon. I admire his work greatly. But 20 years ago, Ted Homer Dixon was telling us that there were going to be great global migrations and vast conflicts based on water shortages. And while water shortages are important and have been responsible for some of those conflicts, the apocalyptic scenarios that some people have predicted just haven't panned out. We can only hope that the apocalyptic scenarios for global warming won't pan out either, because I don't believe there's any capacity for democratic governments inside or outside Canada to fundamentally address the issue.
Catherine, we got about 40 seconds left. Do you want to follow up on that? Is there just a little too much absolute Malthusian, oh my God, the sky is about to fall on us, that the environmental movement indulges in, which doesn't help us at times like this?
I don't think so. I think the scientific community is speaking with increasing urgency and increasingly strong consensus. So I don't see too much Malthusian rhetoric. I think what we haven't talked about is regional differences across Canada and how the politics of this will play out. And certainly the export of oil across British Columbia is not a given for BC voters. So different regions of the country have different stakes in all of that, and that's where we may see some of the opposition emerge that has bite.
Understood. I want to thank all of you for coming on the program tonight and helping us out with this discussion about the environment versus the economy, or the environment and the economy. Catherine Harrison from the University of British Columbia joining us in Vancouver, Brenda Kenny from SEPA joining us in Calgary, Alberta, John Ibbitson from the Globe and Mail joining us from the nation's capital, and here in our studios, Rick Smith, Executive Director of Environmental Defence Canada, and Ben Dacus from the C.D. Howe Institute. Thanks so much, everybody.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.